It's my pleasure today to be able to introduce the person who is going to introduce our program on false confessions when innocent people are convicted of crimes. Christy Martinez, why don't you go ahead and have a seat. Christy Martinez is a professor of law at CU and director of the Corey Wise Innocence Project, about which you'll learn a good deal more today. And but she's only going to be in that position for another month or 6 weeks, because in January of 2019, she will become a county court judge recently appointed by Governor Hickenlooper. So I'll turn the program over to Christy.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, very good. My name is Christy Martinez. This is going to be my last speaking engagement on behalf of the Corey Wise Innocence Project at the law school at the University of Colorado. So I'm going to try to get through this without becoming emotional. It is by far been the most profound experience of my career. I worked for 15 years serving the indigent, and it wasn't until I met Jane and Corey that that my heart was inspired, and I'll tell you why. And to the young men that are here that said they want to make a difference, you can. People like Jane are in the world, and you can learn from them, and you should, because I have. Jane was the attorney that worked on the civil lawsuit as a result of Corey's experience as a member of the Central Park Five. And I guess what I want you to know is during that time, Corey oftentimes didn't have a place to live. And the reason why it's so appropriate for Jane to be a speaker here today is because during the time that Jane tirelessly worked to resolve the civil suit that would compensate Corey for the many years that he spent in prison for a crime that he didn't commit, he oftentimes didn't have a place to live. And Jane and her husband had a place to live. It was a one-bedroom apartment that they lived in New York with 2 small children. And every single time that Corey needed a place to stay, they opened their home. They opened that one room that was their place in the world, and they made him feel safe. And as a result of that, they have cultivated a friendship and a familial relationship that is unlike anything I've ever seen. And so when I tell my students what it means to be a good lawyer, I tell them first, be a good person. Have your heart open, and then develop the skills that will inspire other people to do the right thing, people like yourself. So with no further ado, it is my great and profound honor, and my last time that I ever get to speak with Jane Fisher Byrialsen, because I can never say it correct, and that's so wrong, today. So with no further ado, I'll start with the questions. For those of you that don't know, could you please describe a little bit of the Central Park jogger case and how Corey Wise got involved and wrangled into that false conviction?
Is there anybody that doesn't know what the case is at all? Okay, so in 1989, in April 19th, 1989, there was a white female jogger in Central Park who was brutally raped and almost killed. She lost about 80% of her blood before she was found, and they weren't sure if she was going to survive. So it was a really high-profile case, and the NYPD went in and basically rounded up every kid they could find in the park and in the neighborhood. I think that night they arrested about 30 kids, and by kids they were 14 to around 17, and took them down to the precinct, and everybody was questioned, and 5 of them ended up confessing in very various manners. Corey well, he didn't write it out himself, but there was 3 written statements attributed to him and then 2 videotaped statements before he actually says he was there and participated. DNA testing was then done, and the DNA did not match any of them, but that shows you the power of a confession. The trials went forward, and they were all convicted based on their confessions alone. Corey then did about 13 and a half years in adult prison. He went in at age 16 and came out when he was almost 30. He was exonerated really by the district attorney's office in New York. There was help of defense attorneys, but the district attorney's office ended up filing the motion that exonerated them, because when Corey first got arrested and was in Rikers Island, he was there with a guy named Matias Reyes. And Matias Reyes was the true culprit of the Central Park crime. And Corey's job when he was at Rikers Island was to clean the day room. They had like a little room where they could be and watch TV. And one day he was mopping in there, and he loved to watch, MTV, and he's infatuated with hip hop, and he still listens to hip hop from the 80s. It's like he's stuck in that time period before he went to prison. And so Matias Reyes comes into the day room, and he switches the channel. And Corey goes, "Don't switch the channel, I'm watching that." And so the two of them end up in a fist fight over the TV, and Corey still has a scar sort of under his right eye from that. And they go their separate ways. Corey gets convicted. He goes upstate New York and is in prison. He moves around between different prisons, and I think on the beginning of his 13th year, Matias Reyes, who, had he been caught for the Central Park jogger crime, wouldn't have committed 3 more rapes and murdered a woman while her kids were locked in the bathroom. So he's eventually convicted, Matias Reyes, on the other crimes, but not the Central Park crime. And Corey and him, 12 and a half, 13 years down the line, end up at Auburn Correctional Facility up by the border of Canada and New York. And they're out in the yard at the same time. And I'll say this about the movies: the way they portray the prisons is usually pretty accurate. It's a very brutal and hard environment to live in. And so Matias is new at this prison, and he sees Corey out in the yard, and Corey's been there for some years, so he's got, friends around him and people that support him. And as Matias walks by him, he recognizes him as the guy he's had a fight with at Rikers Island. So he goes up to Corey and he says, "Yo, man, are we good?" And Corey says, "What are you talking about?" And he goes, "You remember we had that fight at Rikers Island?" And Corey's like, "Man, we were kids back then. Don't worry about that." And I think Matias Reyes at that point, and we've interviewed him many times, says, I thought wow, I really started to feel bad. Like, this guy, I know he's in for the crime I did, but he's not, he seems like a really good guy. So Matias Reyes goes to the warden of the prison and says, "This guy Corey is in for the crime I did." And to make a long story short, the wardens then go to the district attorney's office, who thankfully still had the rape kit from the 1989 case, and they run the DNA, and it's Matias. So if those two had not met in that yard 13 years later, Corey could still be in prison today.
Tell us a little bit about how you met Corey.
So I was I went to law school in DC, and I was a I clerked for a judge for 2 years in DC, and then I became a public defender in Manhattan, which was sort of a rude awakening from a girl from Denmark who had not really been in a big American city before then, other than, DC, it was sort of law school, you're in a different environment. But I became a public defender, and we had about 100 cases at a time. And it was really hard to feel like you were doing a good job. And we had night court in Manhattan where you would have to go because they were arresting so many people that court ran from 9 in the morning until 5 p.m. Then there was a break, and then it went from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. And when you did night court, you got to see the people that had been beat up during their arrest, or people that had just been pulled in for no reason, and their cases were being dismissed, but they'd been held for 2 days, and their lives had been disrupted. So my husband and I were both, we weren't married at the time, but we're both public defenders, and we're like, this can't be right that we get clients in here and they're all beat up and we just say, oh, too bad, that's not our job, there's nothing we can do to help you. Or yeah, just be happy that your case got dismissed, nothing we can do about that. So we left the public defender's office after 3 years and started our own practice with the idea to do civil rights and criminal defense work. And we had no idea how to do the civil rights work. I won't say we were winging it, but we were teaching ourselves. And so one day we got a call that they were from the public defender's office that, we know you left to do civil rights work. We have this kid, he's an adult at that point, but he had a high profile criminal case, and now he keeps getting arrested for riding his bike on the sidewalk or jaywalking, and it's really just because the cops are harassing him because he got exonerated. Do you think you could do something? And I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll give it a try. So Corey comes to our office, and he had a riding your bike on the sidewalk misdemeanor in New York, and it was dismissed. And I said, okay, well, let's sue them and then see if they quit arresting you every month. So I sued them in federal court for, wrongful arrest for the riding the bike on the sidewalk. And we go to court, and, I'm wondering, why are there so, I'm one lawyer and it's me and Corey, and there's 7 lawyers at the other table. And I'm thinking, why are there, for riding a bike on a sidewalk, the most they could pay for his 2 days in jail is a couple $1,000s. I don't know what the fight is about that. And I can hear them talking about his other case. Then we go back to our office, and he goes to me, I have another case. I said, well, yeah, but what is that all about? And he goes, well, I don't like my lawyer in that case. Do you think you want to be my lawyer in the other case? And I said, yeah, but what's it about? And he goes, well, just Google me. And so I Googled him. And, his lawsuit at that point against New York City had been pending for about 4 years, but nothing had been happening because there was a motion to dismiss that the judge took 3 years to decide. So we substituted in for his other lawyer, and I really quickly learned a lot about false confessions and civil rights work, and 7.5 years later, we settled the case for him for $13.25 million. So, yeah.
If I understand correctly, that was the largest settlement that, was it the city of New York had ever seen?
It was the largest, I think, national per year monetary settlement for each. So they got, the city ended up sadly paying $41 million to the 5 of them, and Corey's portion of that was $13.25 because they basically split it up for the years they did in prison. So yeah, that was one of the largest, or that is still the largest settlement New York has ever paid.
And once Corey received the settlement, talk to us a little bit about his philanthropy.
So there was a little while where we spent probably 2.5, once they came to terms with actually wanting to settle it, because the 7 years I litigated it, we kept being told it was a no-pay case. And then when they finally came to the table and we knew it was coming, we started talking to Corey about, how different life was going to be from sleeping on a couch and being in and out of our home and our office and the streets, and all of a sudden having millions of dollars. And I think Corey's goal from the beginning was that he wanted to help people who had had things happen to them like had happened to him. And he's extremely passionate about especially helping young people. So when the money came in, it was put in a trust, and he did it with a separate law firm, but they came and told me, they said, if he dies, he doesn't want the money to go to his family and anything. And that didn't really surprise me because he's not too close to them. He wants it to go to the Boys and Girls Club. So if he passes away one day, the Boys and Girls Club are going to have a rather large settlement. But then he also wanted to do something, that he could be more connected with. And so we started looking around at organizations that did exoneration work. And, you know, of course, the first that comes to mind is the National Innocence Project in New York, but they already have a ton of money and weren't, you know, I mean, of course they could use it, but he wanted to do something where he thought it would make a bigger difference. And so we met with some people at CU, and he loved them and loved the school and felt very welcome. So he's been donating to them for 4 years now.
And he comes and meets with the law students regularly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us, so Corey was 16 years old. He was in custody for 17 hours?
No, 72.
Oh, excuse me. 72 hours without an attorney?
Yeah.
And without his parent, where he was interrogated.
Yeah.
And it was during that time that he falsely confessed. I know that that's something that's very difficult for him to talk about. As a result of that, I know you've gotten very involved in false confessions, and in fact, were featured in a documentary that dealt with 4 cases that you've worked on. Tell us a little bit about the documentary and the international acclaim that your documentary has brought about.
So Corey's case was the first case I worked, well, I shouldn't even say that, because there may have been other cases I worked on and not realized it, because part of the problem is it's hard to imagine why somebody would confess to something they didn't do. So Corey's case was the first time where I really got involved in litigating it and understanding the psychology behind it and knowing how to fight it in court. So after Corey's case, we sort of became known in New York City for doing false confession work, and ended up having a large number of those types of cases. And I, being from Denmark, one of our clients was Danish, and he was an intern at a preschool where he was accused by a co-teacher of molesting every kid in the class out in the open in front of everybody. And he confessed to that because the police told him there was a video of him doing it. So when you watch or hear him talk about his confession, he says, well, they told me there was a video of me molesting children. So, I mean, I thought I must have done it and just not remembered it or not been aware of it. So he ends up confessing to that. He was, you know, fortunate that after 7 months, we got the charges against him dropped. But that case was very much in the Danish news, because it's not often that Danish people get arrested on high-profile charges in New York. So once his case was dismissed, this Danish documentarian called Katrina Philip contacted me when we were in Denmark for Christmas and said, you know, you seem kind of interesting. Can I film you? And I said, no, I don't want to be filmed. I'm not interested in that. She called me again and said, well, I've done this other film. It's called Dance With Me. Will you just watch it? You might like it. So I watched it, and I thought it was pretty good. I mean, it's about kids that dance. Wasn't something that I was overly interested in, but it was nicely done. I said, but we still don't want to be filmed. So then she was coming to New York and said, can I just come film you for 1 week, because maybe you're not good at being filmed, because some people are not good at being filmed. She goes, and you might not like me, and I might not end up liking you, so it might not work, but just give me a chance. So I said, okay. And she came and she filmed us at work and at our house, and I actually really did like her. And she is very much an activist, and her activism, to go to what you guys were saying, is through film. She's done a lot of work to bring forward social justice. And so she said, I'd really like to follow your cases on false confessions. And so for 3.5 years, she filmed us and our clients and our cases. And the film has now been shown in the LA Film Festival, where it won the jury selection award. It's been shown many places in Europe. We're in the Copenhagen Docs Film Festival. It won the audience award. It'll be in Denver Saturday and Sunday, and New York next week. So I hope you guys will come watch it.
That's all the questions I have, but I think we do have some time remaining for some questions from the audience. There's supposed to be someone that helps us.
So what are the primary reasons someone confesses to a crime they never
Sure. I think that okay, sure. He asked, what are the primary reasons that someone would confess to a crime they didn't commit? A lot of these cases, and I'll tell you that all of our experts and our psychologists and psychiatrists will say that anybody can confess to a crime they did not commit. And I know that, that's sort of a hard pill to swallow, but a lot of times you see it happening with very young people or people with mental disabilities. Corey has an IQ of 76. Our other clients have been younger and had a lot of them have had learning disabilities. So that's one factor, but I think it can happen to people who don't or aren't young and don't have learning disabilities. And one thing is that the police ask very leading questions instead of asking open-ended questions. They oftentimes give you the information they're looking for in the question, and they're trained in techniques that are super effective and techniques that are, I won't say that are great, but that are really good at getting somebody to confess, which is fine if you really did it. But they can also there's a large danger of them resulting in people confessing to something they didn't do. I'll give you an example. I don't know, I'm sure a lot of you have seen Making a Murderer and the questioning of Brandon Dassey, and that so the police know that the victim in the Stephen Avery and Brandon Dassey case was shot in the head because they have her skull and there's a bullet wound in her skull. Brandon, who I believe was not involved anyway at all in the crime, doesn't know that because he wasn't there. And the police ask him over and over, what happened to her head? What did you guys do to her head? And first he says, I think, well, we cut her hair. And they don't like that because that's not the right answer. So they say, no. Well, what else did you do? Well, we cut her throat. And that doesn't work for them either because there's nothing to corroborate that because the body was burned. And they keep asking him, and you can tell he looks very confused. And then finally they say, well, who shot her in the head? Right? So now he knows that fact that she was shot in the head. And so then all he has to say is, well, Steve shot her in the head. And we see that pattern so much when we watch these false confession videos, is that people will repeatedly say they weren't involved. And the police are trained that if you deny culpability, you get interrupted right away and you are treated in an aggressive manner. If you start giving information, you're treated in a less aggressive manner. And so I think all of those things combined, the leading questions, and the thing that bothers me the most is usually in all these cases, there is a lying about what evidence there is. And that's a huge problem. The courts permit it, but I'm hoping that that's something that will change one day because it's very powerful to have someone come in and say there's a video of you committing a crime, or there's DNA putting you at the crime scene, or there's fingerprints of you at the crime scene, and those things are not true. But the police is allowed to say that to you, and an innocent person internalizes that as, well, oh good, if there's DNA and fingerprints at the crime scene, I'll be free. So I could tell they want me to say that I was there, and then I'll go home. And that's what people think. False confession. And I think Christy might have some extra tickets.
I may have some tickets, so if there's anyone that's interested, you can see me afterwards.
So when someone is being interrogated, like you said he was a teenager for 72 hours, is he allowed food, water, sleep?
So the question was, when somebody's being interrogated for that long, are they allowed food, water, and sleep? Yeah, they usually give them something to drink and food, I think, and not that it's contrived, but I think that that's sort of like, that's the least thing that they're thinking about when they're there. I think Corey, once they've interrogated him for 72 hours and they finally got him to confess, then they turn on the video camera and they place a Pepsi can right in front of him so that, because I think it's like sort of, everybody wants to say, oh, they didn't get to go to the bathroom, they didn't get to eat or drink, but that's the least of what's happening there. But I think usually they get something to drink and eat. Sleep probably not, because they're in a holding cell. I think Corey was in a holding cell when he wasn't in a room being questioned. He was in a holding cell with like 20 or 30 other people with benches.
Are the police receptive to Bruce training them on how to interrogate without?
So the question is, are the police receptive to being trained on techniques to avoid false confessions? You know, I think we're working on that, and we would like them to be, but so far, I would say we have not been received with open arms. In Europe, for example, they're very receptive to this, and they don't use leading questions, and they're not allowed to lie. And I know that there's been a lot of meetings back and forth between European, high-end European law enforcement and the U.S., but I think the technique is so effective that it is a tool that they do not want to give up. In the film, they interviewed a prior NYPD detective, and you could see in the film, this is what he says. He says, well, we're asked to do a job, and we're law enforcement, and you give us a gun, so we could use the gun, and you tell us we can lie, so we can lie. So if you don't want us to do it, then the courts or the legislature has to change that. So I'm hoping that the film will bring awareness and, the laws can change about how questioning can be done. Another problem throughout the country has been, in terms of dealing with it sort of more on a litigation side, is that cities for example, Colorado has, but New York has not videotaped everything that comes before the interrogation. So Corey's at the precinct being questioned on and off for 72 hours, but the video cameras in New York never came on until you already had confessed, and then they're just doing a cleanup video. The film features a case in Denver too, where you can see how different it is and how helpful it is to a defense attorney when you can see the entire process, because you can see somebody breaking down, and you can see how they get from saying, in this Denver case, 65 times, I didn't do it, I don't know what you're talking about, to then falling out of his chair crying and then finally giving up.
One thing I would like to add, though, just so that your community is aware, is Michael Doherty, your newly elected district attorney, did reach out to our organization and invited us to participate in the conviction integrity unit that he created. And he also invited members from the criminal defense bar. And that's the first conviction integrity unit in the state of Colorado. That's the first project like that invited the defense bar to the table and has met regularly, and he's been really, really active in making sure that that part of his vision is realized. And so I'm optimistic to see that sort of collaboration continue. Other jurisdictions have asked if they could attend those meetings and have come up and watched what Boulder was doing. So once again, this particular judicial district, if I'm allowed to glow for a second, because I'm part of your community, is a leader in that regard. And I would very much like to see how that develops. Further dialogue. And Jane was in there on the ground asking for a conviction integrity unit before I knew who Michael Doherty was. So this is really something we've both hoped for, and we're cautiously optimistic that we're going to see that type of collaboration influence law enforcement. Certainly the Timothy Masters case was an expensive case in Fort Collins here in Colorado. And so absolutely there is an economic and a moral interest because there's nothing, I think the wrongful conviction is a reflection on how we're doing as a society, right? I mean, we should never take away someone's due process without fair process. So absolutely, not only economic, but moral as well.
Christy and Jane,
Sorry.
the one that stands up and says, you have to stop the questions, even though it's fascinating. Thank you so much. Christy, it's such an honor to have you here today as your last speaking about such a worthy endeavor. And thank you. If you look at the stage, you can see the 4-way test that we live by every day. So there could not be a better place. Jane, thank you. It's amazing the work that you've done, and we all appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
In your honor, we are going to be, that was my timer. We're going to be donating 100 doses of polio vaccine. And we are this close, and every 100 that we do gets us that much closer. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
I'd like to say a few more words about the tickets that Christy said that she had available. It is a fairly limited number. This is for the showing of False Confessions tomorrow afternoon. It is sold out. It's at 4 p.m. and it includes a reception afterward where Jane and Christy will be there. Christy purchased these tickets herself. She cannot resell them, but she would be very grateful for a donation to the Corey Wise Innocence Project from anyone who would be so moved. So thanks very much, and see Christy afterward if you're interested.